Hello and welcome to Economic Divide with me, Kaveh Tahwayi. In this week's episode, we will look at the ailing EU economy, in which the country's 27-member bloc are suffering some of the worst recessions ever due to the COVID-19 pandemic and its subsequent lockdowns. The actual recession warning was issued roughly back in May of 2020. Now it's almost a year later. How are the EU countries doing? Well, let's take a look at Italy, France, and Spain. In this case, the services sector. As you can see, it's being pummeled. These are some of the countries holding the highest debts in the EU. The Eurozone economy was already expected to contract during the first 3 months of 2021 for it to actually enter a double-dip recession. You may ask what a double-dip recession is. Here's an example of it. This particular one, you can see just the shape of the line. As you can see, it goes up and down there, and there the W is formed. Now, this double-dip recession is actually what happened in the U.S. between the years 1978 and 83. The economy recovered from a recession that peaked in the summer of 1980 to return to positive growth by the end of the year, as is seen towards the end there. But by Christmas of 1981, another deep recession had made its way. Now, if the outlook for the EU remains grim, which it does, then what is the EU going to do about it to make sure that member countries are going to weather economic downturns? This is while many EU countries are still in the midst of the pandemic and are experiencing a recession, countries like France, Germany, Italy, and Greece. European stock markets sinking. Coronavirus to have pushed the world into a recession. Europe and EU countries, no exception.
Well, the first most important thing is to achieve herd immunity. This won't be done overnight. Obviously, a certain number of people have already been infected. We don't know how many people have been infected because so many people that are infected don't show symptoms. But we assume a certain percentage of the population has already been infected.
While infections leading to deaths and lockdowns replaced economic activity, the future looked bleak. Even when the vaccinations had been introduced, the EU was slow in its rollout, plagued by controversy with the UK over the availability.
Anfang der Woche gemeinsam mit anderen Regierungschefs unsere Informationen geteilt und wir haben gemeinsam unsere eigenen Lieferdaten der Mitgliedstaaten verglichen. Und wenn man das tut, dann merkt man, die Lieferungen erfolgen nicht nach Bevölkerungsschlüssel.
Companies have to honor their contract to the European Union before they export to other regions in the world.
Achieving herd immunity, obviously, is to distribute the vaccine. Now, that in itself is a huge task. And it has been slow, certainly in certain countries more than others. But that is the fundamental way that we can get the economy moving again, is to get people vaccinated. Now,
Europe experienced the worst economic contraction since World War II, and maybe even worse, since 2021 future remained uncertain while the pandemic persisted. Meanwhile, the EU, after heated debates and discussions, came up with a rescue plan, over $2 trillion. A ghastly figure, which should be enough to cushion the blow, or will it?
And this, I think, is a remarkable moment of unity for the European Union. It resulted in, indeed, the recovery package and resilience package we have now, Next Generation EU, of an unprecedented magnitude. And now it's up to us to invest it in the right way and in a responsible way.
Stimulus would help in this current environment. And the main thing to focus on is making sure the businesses don't go out of business. The problem is when a business fails, and say a restaurant, once it fails, to get it going again requires investment. And in a situation where no one has got any money because it's been a difficult time for too long, there is very little money around to get businesses started again.
Joining me in the studio is Mick Wallace, member of the European Parliament. Mick Wallace is an Irish politician and former property developer who has been a member of the European Parliament from Ireland for the South constituency since July 2019. He's a member of Independence for Change. It's part of the European United Left Nordic Green Left. Mike Wallace, welcome. The EU, like other unions or countries, has been gripped in the throes of COVID-19 pandemic. Now, the economic decline or recession as a result has been one of the worst that's been recorded at 7% for the year 2020. And for the year 2021, some EU countries have gone into a double-dip recession. Now, what are the plans that the EU has to come out of this recession?
Yeah, well, I think what people outside of Europe need to understand, and inside Europe for that matter, is that the potential recession from the COVID crisis has a different impact on different people. The lockdown has been very selective. For example, in a country like Ireland, the small shops, the family-owned bars and restaurants are closed. But manufacturing industry, meat plants, processing plants, they're all open. Mines, they're all open. So in Ireland at the moment, you could go to work and work inside in a factory where there are 400 or 500 other people. And on your way home from work in the evening, you wouldn't be allowed to visit your friend. You don't have a cafe or a bar or a restaurant to go to. You're not allowed to play outdoor football. But you can work in a factory during the day inside or in a meat plant or a mine. Now, this is a bit ridiculous. But the truth be told is that the EU, and one of the reasons that we actually haven't got a measure on the pandemic, is that we have been too inconsistent in how we've dealt with it. And that inconsistency will reflect.
Lots of interesting points Mick Wallace makes there. Well, let's take a look at what type of social media content is on this topic of the EU, which is pretty widespread in terms of what is happening. Taking a look at our first tweet, the spring 2020 EC forecast projects that the euro area economy will contract by a record 7.7% in 2020, and that it's going to grow by 6.25% for the year 2021. And the EU economy is forecast to contract by 7.5% in 2020 and grow by 6% in 2021. Another response to this, both the depth of the recession and the strength of the recovery will be uneven. That is certain for now. By acting together in the response to the coronavirus pandemic, we can overcome this crisis and build a common, better future. We'll have to wait and see if that happens. A lot of the recovery for the Europe and the European Union countries lie in the vaccination campaigns, which has been slow. Big EU countries like France, Germany, and Italy have administered at least one vaccination shot to less than 10% of their population. Some EU countries have begun to apply stimulus measures, as was evident in one of these tweets, in order to keep their economies afloat.
Outbreak is having a negative impact on the global economy.
European countries feeling the economic decimation, some more than others.
There are huge and significant risks to our economic projections, and most notably including with the pace of vaccination. What we know is the faster countries vaccinate and the quicker they can reopen their economy.
First, Italy. Eyes on the ground, Italians queue in silence for a food handout outside of one of Milan's charity. Since coronavirus swept across the country a year ago, the line has grown and grown.
Non è vita. Almeno per me non è vita. Io non sono abituato torno a dire, a venire qua o chiedere elemosina, perché ho la mia dignità come persona. Io come dignità di persona vorrei anche lavorare, perché dopo bisogna mi manderanno in pensione, ma fino a quel giorno io vorrei lavorare, alzarmi a mattina con la testa alta.
Throughout Italy, the number of people in poverty jumped by 1 million in 2020 to 5.6 million, a 15-year high. In Spain, crushed by COVID, small Spanish firms struggle to survive.
Encontrando con eso, que 1 de cada 5 se puede cerrar, es decir, pueden cerrar pues más de 100.000 tiendas, medio millón de personas se pueden ir al paro y por eso solicitamos al Gobierno que tome medidas inmediatas de reactivación económica. O sea, no pedimos subvenciones, no pedimos préstamos, lo que queremos es que el Gobierno haga que la maquinaria empiece a funcionar. Esto es una bicicleta.
In France, the voice of despair can be heard in this restaurant owner's voice, while glancing at some of the empty tables and chairs in his restaurant.
Là, oui, une amertume totale, avec, pendant ce déconfinement, des hauts et des bas, des couvre-feux, des fermetures à telle heure, pas le café, des incertitudes. On est chef d'entreprise. Les gens nous voient comme des cuisiniers ou des restaurateurs. C'est vrai qu'on est des marchands de bonheur, on tient à le rester, mais on est avant tout des chefs d'entreprise. Et là, ne plus avoir d'horizon du tout pendant un an, c'est considérable, c'est inédit.
From retail to tourism, France is suffering. This snapshot of economic activity for the month of April and March shows how severe the economy was affected. Double digits, all in the negatives. Perhaps these scenes will become commonplace again, like when the Eurozone debt crisis gripped Europe. Austerity was the buzzword back then, with protests breaking out as a result of wage and budget cuts.
Back with me in the studio is Mick Wallace, member of the European Parliament. Mick Wallace, the EU is at risk of a double-dip recession if it hasn't fallen into one already. Employment and retail numbers, they do remain weak. Meanwhile, the COVID vaccine rollout has been a disaster. It's been suggested that in the first quarter of 2021, we would also see the 19-country bloc's economy contract. Now, is the EU in need of a new round of fiscal stimulus, like the US, for example?
Yeah, I mean, we have a big problem in Europe in that you take a country like Ireland, right? We can't print money like the US or the UK can, because the ECB calls the shots. We're in the European Union and they don't want to print money. And the main reason they don't want to print money is because the Germans don't want to print money. And in order to solve these problems or to address some of the challenges of these problems. The Germans have more money than everybody else. People need to understand that the European Union is run by Germany for Germany. And everybody else is secondary. Obviously France, Holland, Austria, some of the Scandinavians are also important players financially. But Germany is the big dog and they make most of the big calls.
But you didn't know that about Germany. Anyways, let's see if some of the social media posts actually have a response there to Mick Wallace. This particular one from Rob Kimball. Meanwhile, in the EU, the German government's Council of Economic Advisors expects Europe's largest economy to shrink by roughly 2% in the first quarter of this year, according to Reuters as a source. The next tweet, the UK is already on course for the deepest downturn of any major economy. And as CNN reported, Brexit, a major factor, as the ability to do deep EU, US and Chinese deals fall apart, and 19 EU-CU deals have not rolled over. Global Britain was a soundbite only. Interesting way of characterizing it. Well, if we were to take a look at that, that's probably not something that's going to happen immediately because of the fact that we're looking at EU sanctioning China, for example. And that's the point that I raised earlier in the program. Well, we're going to take a quick break here on Economic Divide, but don't go anywhere, as we have plenty more coming up after these short messages. So stay right where you are. Hello and welcome to our Info News section. First up, Saudi Aramco. Its profits fell 44% for the year 2020. It attributed the reason to lower oil prices that stemmed from the pandemic cutting into the earnings. And then, get this, even though there was a decrease in earnings, it still pledged to pay $75 billion in dividends. And where did the dividends go to? The Saudi government, most of it, because it owns 98% of Aramco. Well, it was World Water Day this past week. How do you value water was the title to this story. 844 million people lack basic drinking water access. That's more than 1 out of every 10 people on the planet. Women and girls spend an estimated 200 million hours hauling water every day. And every day, more than 800 children under the age of 5 die from diarrhea attributed to poor water. Does that answer the question on how we value water? Okay. Next up, the issue of how tax evasion by the rich is still a problem in the U.S. It's seen in this next headline. This is tax evasion. Richest 1% of U.S. households don't report 21% of their income using complete tax avoidance strategies. That allows them to outmaneuver the federal governments. It said we estimate that 36% of federal income taxes unpaid are owed by the top 1%. And on to our final story from the South China Morning Post. Russia-China can reduce sanctions risks by moving away from the U.S. dollar. Now that should work together to resist American sanctions by becoming more self-reliant in science and technology and thus move away from the U.S. dollar for trade. All right, time now to take a look at our final report, which takes a look at the EU's economic signs since the 2008 world financial crisis, which erupted into the EU debt crisis. Did the EU ever grow out of the crisis, or has it just lingered on until the coronavirus hit, which has now pushed it over the edge?
The EU has been slammed for its handling of the vaccine rollout.
We have to be absolutely clear and stop it. Stop it. With AstraZeneca, with these dirty tricks, we cannot accept it.
This bad performance of AstraZeneca has created a reputational issue for all of us, be it the Commission or the Member States.
There are huge popular waves of Euroscepticism and a lack of trust in national European institutions, and even worse, in its leaders. But the leaders, like the ambitious French President Emmanuel Macron, have made their positions clear. No compromise at the cost of the European ambition, as seen in the EU recovery plan.
Mais ces compromis, je le dis très clairement, ne se feront pas au prix de l'ambition européenne. Pas pour le principe, mais parce que nous sommes face à une crise qui est inédite sur le plan sanitaire, économique et social, parce que nos pays en ont besoin et l'unité de l'Europe en a besoin.
Realistically, debt doesn't seem to really be an issue anymore. And the reason why is that we've got into the habit of printing money whenever there's a problem. And we keep printing money. And everybody keeps printing money.
Reactions to the rescue plan have been positive, like in the case of debt-ridden Italy.
Presidente, onorevoli senatrici, onorevoli senatori.
Where the money from the EU recovery plan can or cannot be applied is also one mired in controversy.
Relancer le fret si on ne construit pas des wagons. C'est pas une évidence de le dire, mais c'est mieux quand on le répète.
È un prestito strano quello che mi concedono per dire con questi soldi tu però puoi sistemare la camera da letto e la cucina, ma se vuoi sistemare il bagno e il salotto no, perché c'è l'olandese di turno che ti dice no.
COVID-19 may have affected many industries like tourism, but perhaps the post-COVID period will usher in a new era of economic hope.
Da questa tragedia, tra virgolette, dovremmo avere la capacità di ripartire in un modo differente, altrimenti sprecheremo un'occasione. Sicuramente la Costa d'Amalfi negli ultimi anni aveva avuto un afflusso di turisti forse anche troppo elevato, soprattutto
Back in the studio with Mick Wallace, member of the European Parliament. Mick, our final question to you. The 2008 financial crisis resulted in the Eurozone debt crisis of over 1 trillion euros that was needed in bailout funds. Top countries like Greece, France, Italy, and Spain, they accrued massive debts. These countries are still the highest risk countries even before the pandemic hit. Why were they not able to make the strides necessary to improve economically, do you think? And now they are facing a more severe downturn due to the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, look at political philosophies vary. And in my opinion, the European Union made a huge mistake in how it dealt with the banking crisis. This was a crisis that was created by nobody else but the financial institutions. And the financial institutions did not suffer from the crisis. They were bailed out, they came out of it fine, and they're all doing grand, thank you very much. But lots of people have suffered dramatically from it and haven't recovered from it. Those countries were amalgamated into the European Union overnight. There was two guiding principles that made that happen. Number one, they wanted a cheap pool of labour from Eastern Europe to be able to supply mainly seasonal work and menial labour tasks in Western developed Europe. Number two, they wanted many of those countries, especially those that were close to the Russian border, they wanted to get them into NATO.
All right, we want to thank Mick Wallace, European Parliament member, for his thoughts here. Okay, it's time now for 1,000 words. It's time now for an in-depth section. It's actually a good time to go back to when the Eurozone debt crisis broke out and what it was. Well, amid the 2008 financial crisis, many Eurozone countries were unable to control their debts due to exposure to the banks, and this became known as the Eurozone debt crisis. Many countries needed bailouts, countries like Greece, Ireland, Spain, and Portugal. The EU and the IMF agreed to a €750 billion or $1 trillion for these crisis-hit Eurozone countries. Now, fast forward to the year 2020. How did the $1 trillion bailout actually fare out? Well, the ratio of government debt to GDP, as you can see here, was 176.6%. That really put into question why the bailout didn't help, or worse yet, where the money went. And here we are, the year 2021. Europe is in the throes of a COVID-19 pandemic, the third to have hit. And we're seeing a repeat of another bailout. The figure? Did I hear $1 trillion? $2 trillion. No, the amount, $2.2 trillion or 1.85 trillion euros, backed by a joint debt. Now here are the countries getting the first batch of the bailout money. You can see Italy, Spain, and France with the various amounts. And finally, the big question is whether this huge bailout money will work or not. Well, let's take a look at the map of Europe that's color-coded over here. The countries in green have national debts below 100 billion euros, yellow to be below 1 trillion euros, and the ones in red above 1 trillion euros. So there you can see whether this actually worked or not. In closing, I could talk about how badly some EU countries are doing economically and how the EU and the ECB, the European Central Bank, will come to the rescue again. I mean, the effort will be made to save these economies. I mean, there can't be any other way, can it? To save the Euro project. That's the goal. One would think the EU would do everything it can to not lose any business. Well, if that's the case, then why does it go and sanction China? Or why does it sanction Iran or Russia? I mean, in the case of Iran, it could do business with Iran. It could do a lot of business with Iran. It's supposed to do it due to the JCPOA, but it's not. Russia, yes, it does do business with Russia, but it goes ahead and sanctions its officials, including China. Furthermore, talk about Russia. Why doesn't it, or didn't it use the Russian Sputnik 5 vaccine? It's known to be effective. I mean, the rollout in the EU was very slow. The economy could have been rolling right now, a lot more than it is. I mean, shouldn't human lives be more important than politics? Well, that does it for this edition of Economic Divide. Thanks so much for tuning in. Any questions or comments, do send them to us the old-fashioned way. Our email address is right on your screen. From me, the entire team is goodbye until next week.